Welcome back to New Rockstars. I'm Hector Navarro, and today I'm talking about something very, very exciting, a brand new book. Now hang on, this is a book you nerds will actually care about, so stick with me here. Look Out for the Little Guy by Scott Lang, fictional character from the MCU and author of this now very real book. We saw Scott talking about his memoir in Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, and Scott's book tour was even briefly mentioned at the bottom of a news ticker under Anderson Cooper in Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, linking the events of those two films happening around the same time, the spring and summer of 2025. So what is this book? Well, it's a first-hand account written from the perspective of Ant-Man himself of the events spanning Ant-Man, Captain America: Civil War, Ant-Man and the Wasp, and Avengers: Endgame, with a little extra stuff before, in between, and after those movies. What was basically just a movie prop for Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania is now a real book you can buy and read and gift to your MCU-loving friends. And surprisingly, it's also a pretty great self-help book. I can't believe the MCU has now also given us a self-help book. Just like how Rogers the Musical was designed as a joke at first, but then ended up being kinda earnest, Look Out for the Little Guy may have started as an in-movie joke, but because the character of Scott Lang is a former convict and a dad who really loves his daughter and family, there are genuine moments of warmth and heroism and positive thinking wrapped up in all the funny stuff. I found myself nodding along multiple times while reading it, thinking to myself, yeah, I really gotta apply that mindset to my life more. So way to go, Scott. And the fun thing is, we learn a little bit more about the MCU from Scott and the various Avenger characters he talks to for the book. So I'm gonna tell you all the fun stuff we learned and maybe give you a little life advice along the way. Just do me a favor and go get the book yourself if you're even a little interested. It's a fun and breezy read, and it might change your life. Plus, it really sounds like Paul Rudd as Scott Lang, so kudos to probably real writer Rob Kuttner, who's credited in the acknowledgments in the back as Scott's writing coach, cheerleader, late night texter, transcriber, and occasional crying partner. You killed it, Rob. First question answered. How did Scott decide to write this book? Well, according to him, it wasn't his idea. It was the Avengers' idea, specifically Bruce Banner and Clint Barton, who take Scott out to lunch and tell him they think the world at large should know the specific details of what went down during the blip and how they defeated Thanos, and that Scott is the perfect guy to do it because he's the everyman Avenger. Clint tells Scott, "You're the guy who got scooped up in all this pretty recently. You still got one foot in their world, and you're a guy everyone likes and trusts." Then Bruce says, "It's tough stuff, and no one knows how to keep it light like you." It's my Mark Ruffalo impression. It makes sense that they'd pick Scott to do this, considering Banner is a super genius Hulk, no longer really a part of the normal human world, and Barton went off the deep end in those 5 years and became a vigilante assassin. Scott really is the everyman Avenger. This might also kind of explain why Scott later made a podcast appearance that Kamala Khan, Ms. Marvel, was a listener of, because Scott is taking it upon himself to share insider Avenger knowledge with the world. Then, after learning that Scott asked Doctor Strange about his 14,605 potential alternate lives, because who wouldn't be curious, but Strange didn't tell him anything, Scott commits to writing the book and plans to talk about his life along with Avengers history. So, just like in Quantumania, we get the sense that maybe Scott is building himself up a little bit throughout the book, boosting his own ego, and not taking full credit, but definitely mentioning his key role in saving the universe and bringing everyone back from the blip a lot, which means we might have an unreliable narrator on our hands. But that's okay. It fits Scott's inflated ego at the beginning of Quantumania, so that when he gets confronted by Kang the Conqueror in that story, it shakes Scott to his core. One thing we can rely on as being true is that Scott admits he just wants people to ask him to take a picture with their dog, which explains that genuine smile when he finally gets asked that at the beginning of Quantumania. So I'm going to try and lay out everything in chronological order, starting with a fun detail we learn about Hank Pym. When he was first testing out the ant communication technology he invented, it didn't go exactly according to plan, and he was almost killed on a shrunken journey to his backyard anthill. Hope Van Dyne recounted this to Scott when he was training to be Ant-Man in 2015, saying that her dad told her if it wasn't for a bigger centipede that he and the ants had to work together to defeat, he might have been killed by the ants themselves. This feels like a reference to Tales to Astonish number 35, the first appearance of Hank Pym wearing the Ant-Man costume in the comics, and where he had to take down a beetle, not a centipede, but still. It's fun to imagine a young Michael Douglas living out some of those early Ant-Man comic book adventures. They're great. Cut to 2012, where Scott and the rest of the world was witnessing the events of the first Avengers movie, and then after that is when Scott first learned about the crimes his company, San Francisco tech giant VistaCorp were committing. This all tracks because according to a 2015 episode of WHIH Newsfront hosted by Christine Everhart, we know that Scott had been in prison for 3 years, placing his arrest and imprisonment in 2012. What might be a new revelation, though, is that according to Scott, he and his ex-wife Maggie's marriage was already over before Scott got arrested. He also deeply regrets not telling Maggie his plans to commit the crime, to break into VistaCorp, to refund regular people their stolen money back. This self-reflection now affects how Scott acts in his relationship with Hope, sharing everything in his life with her, which is what we should all be doing with our partners, so take that life advice to heart. This information from Scott also lines up with the Ant-Man prelude comic Scott Lang's Small Time MCU Infinite Comic #1, where Scott learned about VistaCorp, told Maggie, but then didn't tell her he was going to do something about it. Yay, continuity! While in prison, we learn that Scott took up gardening to keep himself busy, focusing on a 3x6 foot patch of grass. He would later reapply that kind of mental focus to his house arrest from 2016 to 2018. The other new information about Scott during his time in prison is that instead of trying to pick fights with the toughest guys in the yard, he asked them when their birthdays were and actually sang to them on that date. Why? Because people still wanted to be treated like full human beings in prison. And Scott became the guy, getting along with everybody in there. More great life advice to consider. In the book, there's also maybe a reveal that Scott Lang's mom is alive and disappointed in him being Ant-Man, but it could have also just been for a bit. Scott tends to crack jokes after all, that's kind of his thing. But back in 2015, after he's released from prison, the events of the first Ant-Man movie take place, and we learn a little bit more about what happened from Scott's point of view. Also, I don't know how vital this information is, but I thought it was hilarious. Apparently, Hank Pym trained an ant to take photos for them to document their training, and they're used for the book. And Scott says they call him Ansel Adams. Great. And we learned that Scott did more training with ants after his successful mission into Avengers compound and Darren Cross visiting Hank Pym later that night. Look out for the little guy puts the events of Captain America Civil War immediately after the events of Ant-Man, where Hope and Hank were just beginning to trust Scott, and then Scott goes and takes the Ant-Man suit without asking to help Cap in Germany. This doesn't exactly line up with what we know about the MCU timeline, where Ant-Man takes place in the summer of 2015 and Civil War took place in May of 2016, almost a year later, but maybe Scott is talking about how the months in between these movies felt like they were happening right on top of each other, with the Pyms just barely beginning to trust Scott before he runs off with Clint Barton Hawkeye. In an interview that Scott conducts with her, Hope Van Dyne describes in detail what she was going through at the time, emotionally and mentally, and how Scott didn't really know about that. Growing up with Hank Pym as a father, having all of his incredibly important work almost be taken away from them because of Scott's decision to break the law again, forcing her and her father Hank on the run. And then 2 years later, Hope sees her mother again, alive, after decades thinking that she was dead. But then Scott says Hope doesn't have to go through it alone, and he's there for her, and she for him, 200%, which is the amount we should all strive to be present for our partners as well. See, that's just great life advice. One-shot energy, huh? Okay, I'll try it.
Oh yeah.
Whoa! What does One Shot's Focus Chew do? Whoa. One Shot really is all you need. Begin your transformation with One Shot Energy today by going to oneshotenergy.com/new rockstars for 10% off your order. During his house arrest, Scott kept in touch with friends and loved ones with video conferencing technology, and the book makes a joke that maybe that sort of thing will catch on one day. He also lists off the various cardboard attractions that he made to entertain his daughter Cassie while being stuck at home, like a cardboard roller coaster, a cardboard robot war, a cardboard pony ride, and probably a very bad idea, a cardboard water park. And, hypothetically, Scott says he once used Pym particles to enlarge a jelly donut for Cassie at his house. Hypothetically. New info here, Scott reveals that Hope Van Dyne can control the shrinking and growing feature of her suit with her mind and controls in her helmet, whereas Scott still has to use buttons to activate those abilities. Next is a chapter called Infinity Saga Abridged, which is perfect. Scott describes what was going through his head after escaping the quantum realm in 2023 and reuniting with his daughter, Cassie. She was the one who had to tell Scott what happened. Scott says they spent the night looking at a photo album, quote, poring over the endless smiling faces of people who suddenly got yanked out of our lives. Maggie, Paxton, Luis, Kurt, Dave, we still don't know if the Ant-Man supporting cast was dusted or not, but considering Luis's van was impounded, I'm leaning towards Luis at least being gone for those 5 years. Speaking of that van, Scott then drove it all the way to Avengers compound, and Steve Rogers and Natasha Romanoff had to explain to Scott exactly what had happened after they let him in. They tell Scott about Thanos collecting the Infinity Stones before the snap, and Scott didn't even know there was a snap. He just knows of the disappearance event as the blip, giving us more insight into how much the general public knew about what happened. This is again probably part of the reason the other Avengers later wanted someone to share this information with the public. Steve and Nat give some updates to Scott about the rest of the Avengers, like how Bruce Banner was in Mexico and that Tony visited him, which we heard about in She-Hulk Attorney at Law, and that last they heard Thor was in New Asgard, which was true. We hear this entire conversation between the three of them before catching us right back up to that scene in Endgame where Steve asks,
Scott, are you okay?
Have either of you guys ever studied quantum physics?
Only to make conversation.
That's all in the book, and the fact that Scott Lang has a pretty amazing recall for these conversations makes sense. They're some of the most important interactions Scott has ever had. I would also remember every single word Captain America and Black Widow told me. Next is learning about what Scott went through during his experiments with Hulk in time travel. We get a snippet of that in Quantumania in the car, where we hear,
And in that moment, all I could think was, how did the Hulk turn me into a baby? Am I the Hulk's baby?
which was hilarious. But I found a potential error in the printed book where the next words don't match up to what we hear in the car scene.
But I was ready for anything. Steve and
This
I
is the
were
radio.
close over that.
These few lines are missing from the book, but don't worry, Marvel Studios, you can send me a famous Marvel No Prize because I have found a way to reconcile this inconsistency. Scott was listening to an early version of the audiobook before the book was edited for the final print version, which is why there are a few lines that didn't make the cut in the final printed book. Boom, done. So then the rest of the events of Avengers Endgame are described from Scott's point of view, including that hilarious moment we heard about in the car in Quantumania where Scott says,
A little after that, a raccoon from space showed up. I don't think he knew my name. I was just happy to meet a raccoon who could talk.
in the movie, we sort of hear the audiobook in a different order than the passages in the book actually are, but it's okay because Scott was probably skipping around, not just fast forwarding, when he was trying to make his daughter Cassie laugh. So we know how genuinely excited Scott was to meet someone who mostly operated in space, Rocket, that it's understandable to learn that Scott was a bit disappointed that his assigned mission in the time heist, traveling to an alternate reality of New York in 2012, was the only one that wasn't in space because Asgard in 2013 and Morag and Vormir in 2014 were all in space. Plus, not that we needed it, but this book offers yet another confirmation that the time heist in Endgame wasn't time travel up and down the MCU's sacred timeline, but rather travel to different timelines, alternate realities. So it's confirmed that Steve Rogers ended up in an alternate reality where he retired with a Peggy Carter, not hidden behind the scenes retired this entire time with the sacred timelines Peggy. I'm sorry. It's a bummer, but it's true. A great meta reference during this section is where Scott details how the Tesseract they were supposed to steal ends up being stolen by who he calls Alt 2012 Loki, and that one can only imagine what that led to, referencing the events of Loki Season 1, where we saw exactly what that led to. Also, Lang interviewed other Avengers to get specific details on the time heist, and Clint Barton, Hawkeye, reveals a lot of what happened on Vormir before Black Widow sacrificed herself for the Soul Stone. Barton believes it was him saying, "Tell my family I love them," that cemented Romanoff's decision to sacrifice herself and spare Clint. And I'm hoping we see future installments of the MCU, like maybe the upcoming Thunderbolts movie, have characters acknowledge this book. Look out for the little guy. Natasha's sister, Yelena Belova, never really got the specifics of what happened to her sister, and maybe she can refer to having read this book in a future MCU installment. It's also interesting to re-experience this part. Scott describing the fourth only ever time he went giant to save Rocket and Rhodey from Avengers compound collapsing on them, with the knowledge that James Rhodes here might have been a Skrull named Rava. The book also makes a point to explain why Scott Lang didn't pass out after being Giant Man during the Battle of Earth for a few reasons. 1, Scott was in better shape. 2, Scott's adrenaline overrode his emotions. 3, Scott was fighting on the side of heroes, not against, and maybe most importantly, that 4, he finally knew when to stop being big, unlike in Germany and the San Francisco Bay. Then we read about Hope coming back and her and Scott reuniting, then another great joke at the MCU's expense. Scott describes, then we all heard it. the tiny but somehow audible to thousands command of Captain America. Avengers, assemble. Fans have asked how all those assembled heroes could have heard Cap's whisper across the battlefield, and here you have Ant-Man explaining that they somehow just did. Maybe Kamartaj's wizards were handing out earpieces as they portaled around the universe gathering heroes, but that's just my take on it. I'll happily take a second no prize though, Marvel, happily. Then even Scott couldn't believe Luis's van survived the battle so far. He later learned from the Wasp who Captain Marvel was when she came in, and in one of the most heartbreaking sections of the memoir, Scott reminds the reader that Tony Stark was also a father who gave up a life with his daughter Morgan so that everyone else could be reunited with their loved ones. So after Endgame, Scott hangs out with Luis, and there is no confirmation one way or the other that Luis was around during the blip 5 years or not. But Luis doesn't do what everyone wants him to do and sum up the events of the MCU since Ant-Man and the Wasp. Instead, he rattles off possible scenarios of Scott Lang's life had he made different decisions at crucial moments in his life, which is really fun. Bring back Luis, y'all. He's great. Come on, bring him back. And here, post-Endgame, Scott mentions that Clint Barton has his hands full with his family and a new protege, which means that Scott Lang was writing the book during or after the events of Christmas in 2024. Scott also describes some adventures that he and the Wasp went on that we didn't see, which makes sense. After Endgame, the kick-ass duo of crime fighters are finally reunited, so of course they're gonna keep being Ant-Man and the Wasp. Now, Scott's family is tired of hearing about his superhero stuff. Might be another reason he wrote the book, to get it all down on paper and spare them from hearing him talking about being an Avenger. And another interesting confession is that Scott admits things between him and teenage daughter Cassie are complicated, setting up the character development between them both in Quantumania. But just like that film, this book has Scott reflecting on how much time he's lost with Cassie. And there's also a possible meta joke about Scott being surprised what decade of life he's already in, maybe a reference to actor Paul Rudd's seeming immortality. And Scott at one point also mentions how Janet Van Dyne refuses to talk about her time in the quantum realm, again setting up the events of Quantumania rather nicely. Another fun detail about the book is that at one point Scott says with almost 100% certainty that the quantum realm doesn't include intelligent life forms. We all know how that worked out. So yes, we get to the end of the book and it's pretty much exactly like the opening narration of Quantumania, with some extra lines added in between what Scott is saying to the audience in the movie. Also, gotta point out that the actual book's back cover is similar but different to the book back cover we see in the movie. And that brings us up to the events of Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. So there you have it, folks, all the fun new MCU details we learned from reading Scott Lang's new book. My next question is, full Paul Rudd audiobook version when? I mean, it's not like he's doing anything else, right? Because of the strikes? So pay him fairly and get this sucker recorded, Disney, Marvel. My next question is, what other MCU novel would you like to see Marvel Studios publish next? Here's my pitch: a decades-long account of the Sacred Timeline's Steve Rogers and his life in the alternate reality where he stayed with Peggy Carter, where he undoubtedly changed his world for the better. Did he go and find Bucky immediately? Build relationships with the people of Wakanda sooner? Prep the world for the incoming Chitauri and Thanos threats? You bet your America's ass he did, and I want to read all about it. So please, go get your copy of Scott's new book so that Marvel can keep bringing us new MCU stories in new formats. And try to find the fun detail about Black Widow that I left out of the breakdown. Let me know in the comments below if you think you found it. Follow me over at Heroes Reforged on YouTube. See you next time, and remember, if there's one thing life's taught me, there's always room to grow.